Alrighty, and we are live. Give me just a moment. Let me make sure that is the case over on YouTube and Rumble. Just a moment. Da. Yes, we are live on YouTube. And how about Rumble? Let's find out. Yes, we are live on Rumble. Outstanding. Thank you, everyone, for joining me yet again. I am Mikhail the Stray Cat, and we are going to get back into Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics, Chapter 5. The Rise and Fall of Businesses. And without further ado, we will pick up where we left off last time. Economic changes. Economic changes include not only changes in the economy, but also changes within the managements of firms, especially in their responses to external economic changes. Many things that we take for granted today as features of a modern economy were resisted when first proposed and had to fight uphill, to establish themselves by the power of the marketplace. Even something as widely used today as bank credit cards were initially resisted. When Bank AmeriCard and MasterCharge, later MasterCard, first appeared in the 1960s, leading New York department stores such as Macy's and Bloomingdale's said that they had no intention of accepting bank credit cards as payments for purchases in their stores, even though there were already millions of people with such cards in the New York metropolitan area. Only after the success of these credit cards in smaller stores did the big department stores finally relent and begin accepting credit cards. In 2003, for the first time, more purchases were made by credit card or debit cards than by cash. That same year, Fortune magazine reported that a number of companies made more money from their own credit card business with its interest charges than from selling goods and services. Sears made more than half its profits from its credit cards, and Circuit City made all of its profits from its credit cards while losing $17 million on its sales of electronic merchandise. Neither individuals nor companies are successful forever. Death alone guarantees turnover in management. Given the importance of the human factor and the variability among people, or even with the same person at different stages of life, it can hardly be surprising that dramatic changes over time in the relative positions of businesses have been the norm. Some individual executives are very successful during one era in the country's evolution or during one period in their own lives, and very ineffective at a later time. Sewell Avery, for example, was for many years during the 20th century a highly successful and widely praised leader of U.S. Gypsum and later of Montgomery Ward. Yet his last years were marked by public criticism and controversy over the way he ran Montgomery Ward and by a bitter fight for control of the company that he was regarded as mismanaging. When Avery resigned as chief executive officer, the value of Montgomery Ward's stock rose immediately. Under his leadership, Montgomery Ward had put aside so many millions of dollars, as a cushion against an economic downturn that Fortune magazine called it, quote, a bank with a storefront, unquote. Meanwhile, rivals like Sears were using their money to expand into new markets. What is important is not the success or failure of particular individuals or companies, but the success of particular knowledge and insights in prevailing despite the blindness or resistance of particular business owners and managers. Given the scarcity of mental resources, an economy in which knowledge and insights have such decisive advantages in the competition of the marketplace is an economy which itself has great advantages in creating a higher standard of living for the population at large. A society in which only members of a hereditary aristocracy, a military junta, I'm probably mispronouncing that, or a ruling political party can make major decisions is a society which has thrown away much of the knowledge, insights, and talents of most of its own people, A society in which such decisions can only be made by males has thrown away half of its knowledge, talents, and insights. Contrast societies with such restricted sources of decision making ability with a society in which a farm boy who walked 8 miles to Detroit to look for a job could end up creating the Ford Motor Company and changing the face of America. Hold on. Away. Sorry, that was a notification. Excuse me. Creating the Ford Motor Company and changing the face of America with mass produced automobiles, or a society in which a couple of young bicycle mechanics could invent the airplane and change the whole world. Neither a lack of pedigree, nor a lack of academic degrees, nor even a lack of money could stop ideas that worked, for investment money is always looking for a winner to back and cash in on. A society which can tap all kinds of talents from all segments of its population has obvious advantages over societies in which only the talents of a pre-selected few are allowed to determine its destiny. No economic system can depend on the continuing wisdom of its current leaders. A price-coordinated economy with competition in the marketplace does not have to, because those leaders can be forced to change course or be replaced, whether because of red ink, irate stockholders, outside investors ready to move in and take over, or because of bankruptcy. Given such economic pressures, it is hardly surprising that economies under the thumbs of kings or commissars have seldom matched the track record of economies based on competition and prices. Technological changes. For decades during the 20th century, television sets were built around a cathode ray tube. I might be mispronouncing that, in which an image was projected from the small back end of the tube to the larger front screen where the picture was viewed. But a new century saw this technology replaced by new technologies that produced a thinner and flatter screen with sharper images. By 2006, only 21% of the television sets sold in the United States had picture tube technology, while 49% of all television sets sold had liquid crystal display (LCD) screens, and another 10% had plasma screens. For more than a century, Eastman Kodak Company was the largest photographic company in the world. In 1976, Kodak sold 90% of all the film sold in the United States and 85% of all the cameras. But new technology created new competitors. At the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, digital cameras began to be produced not only by such traditional manufacturers of cameras for film as Nikon, Canon, and Minolta, but also by producers of other computerized products such as Sony and Samsung. Moreover, quote, smartphones, unquote, could now take pictures, providing easy substitutes for the kinds of small, simple, and inexpensive cameras that Kodak manufactured. Film sales began falling for the first time after 2000, and digital camera sales surpassed the sales of film cameras for the first time 3 years later. This sudden change left Kodak scrambling to convert from film photography to digital photography, while companies specializing in digital photography took away Kodak's customers. The ultimate irony in all of this was that the digital camera was invented by Kodak. But apparently, other companies saw its potential earlier and developed the technology better. By the third quarter of 2011, Eastman Kodak reported a $222 million loss, its ninth quarterly loss in 3 years. Both the price of its stock and the number of its employees fell to less than 1/10 of what they had once been. In January 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy. Meanwhile, its biggest competitor in the business, the Japanese firm Fuji, which produced both film and cameras, diversified into other fields, including cosmetics and flat-screen television. Similar technological revolutions have occurred in other industries and in other times. Clocks and watches for centuries depended on springs and gears to keep time and move the hour and minute hands. The Swiss became renowned for the high quality of the internal watch mechanisms they produced, and the leading American watch company in the mid 20th century, Bulova, used mechanisms made in Switzerland for its best selling watches. However, the appearance of quartz timekeeping technology in the early 1970s, which was more accurate and had lower costs, led to a dramatic fall in the sales of Bulova watches and vanishing profits for the company that made them. As the Wall Street Journal reported, quote, for 1975, the firm reported a $21 million loss on $55 million in sales. That year, the company was reported to have 8% of domestic U.S. watch sales, 1/10 of what it claimed at its zenith in the early 1960s. Unquote. Changes in business leadership. Perhaps the most overlooked fact about industry and commerce is that they are run by people who differ greatly from one another in insight, foresight, leadership, organizational ability, and dedication, just as people do in every other walk of life. Therefore, the companies they lead likewise differ in the efficiency with which they perform their work. Moreover, these differences change over time. The automobile industry is just one example. According to Forbes Business Magazine in 2003, quote, other automakers can't come close to Toyota on how much it costs to build cars, unquote. And this shows up on the bottom line. Quote, Toyota earned $1,800 for every vehicle sold. GM made $300 and Ford lost $240. Unquote, Forbes reported. Toyota, quote, makes a net profit far bigger than the combined total for Detroit's Big Three, unquote, according to The Economist magazine in 2005. But by 2010, Detroit's Big Three automakers were earning more profits per vehicle than the average of Toyota and Honda. By 2012, the Ford Motor Company's annual profit was $5.7 billion, while General Motors earned $4.9 billion and Toyota earned $3.45 billion. Toyota's lead in the quality of its cars was likewise not permanent. Business Week in 2003 reported that, although Toyota spent fewer hours manufacturing each automobile, its cars had fewer defects than those of any of the American Big Three automakers. High rankings for quality by Consumer Reports magazine during the 1970s and 1980s have been credited with helping Toyota's automobile gain widespread acceptance in the American market, and though Honda and Subaru overtook Toyota, good Lord, in the Consumer Reports rankings in 2007, Toyota continued to outrank any American automobile manufacturer in quality at that time. Over the years, however, competition from Japanese automakers, brought marked improvements in American-made cars, quote, closing the quality gap with Asian automakers, unquote, according to the Wall Street Journal. However, in 2012, Consumer Reports reported that, quote, a perfect storm of reliability problems, unquote, dropped the Ford Motor Company out of the top 10 while Toyota swept the top spots. Although Toyota surpassed General Motors as the world's largest automobile manufacturer, in 2010 it had to stop production and recall more than 8 million cars because of problems with their acceleration. Neither quality leadership nor any other kind of leadership is permanent in a market economy. What matters far more than the fate of any given business is how much its efficiency can benefit consumers. As Business Week said of the Walmart retail chain, quote, at Walmart, everyday low prices is more than a slogan. It is the fundamental tenet of a cult masquerading as a company. New England Consulting estimates that Walmart saved its U.S. customers $20 billion last year alone. End of quote. Business leadership is a factor not only in the relative success of various enterprises, but more fundamentally in the advance of the economy as a whole through the spread of the impact of new and better business methods to competing companies and other industries. While the motives for these improvements are the bottom lines of the companies involved, the bottom line for the economy as a whole is the standard of living of the people who buy the products and services that these companies produce. Although we measure the amount of petroleum in barrels, which is how it was once shipped in the 19th century, today it is actually shipped in railroad tank cars or tanker trucks on land or in gigantic oil tankers at sea. The most famous fortune in American history, that of John D. Rockefeller, I do not like that name, was made by revolutionizing the way oil was refined and distributed, drastically lowering the cost of delivering its various finished products to the consumer. When Rockefeller entered the oil business in the 1860s, there were no automobiles, so the principal use of petroleum was to produce kerosene for lamps, since there were no electric lights then either. When petroleum was refined to produce kerosene, the gasoline that was a byproduct was so little valued that some oil companies simply poured it into a river to get rid of it. In an industry where many investors and businesses went bankrupt, Rockefeller made the world's largest fortune by revolutionizing the industry. Shipping his oil in railroad tank cars rather than in barrels like his competitors was just one of the cost-saving innovations that made Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company the biggest and most profitable enterprise in the petroleum industry. He also hired scientists to create numerous new products from petroleum, ranging from paints to paraffin to anesthetics to Vaseline, and they used gasoline for fuel in the production process instead of letting it go to waste. Kerosene was still the principal product of petroleum, but because Standard Oil did not have to recover all its production costs from the sale of kerosene, it was able to sell the kerosene more cheaply. The net result, from a business standpoint, was that Standard Oil ended up selling about 90% of the kerosene in the country. From the standpoint of the consumers, the results were even more striking. Kerosene was literally the difference between light and darkness for most people at night. As the price of kerosene fell from 58 cents a gallon in 1865 to 26 cents a gallon in 1870, and then to 8 cents a gallon during the 1870s, far more people were able to have light after sundown. As a distinguished historian put it, quote, "Before 1870, only the rich could afford whale oil and candles. The rest had to go to bed early to save money. By the 1870s, with the drop in the price of kerosene, middle and working class people all over the nation could afford the 1 cent an hour that it cost to light their homes at night. Working and reading became after-dark activities new to most Americans in the 1870s." End of quote. The later rise of the automobile created a vast new market for gasoline, just as Standard Oil's more efficient production of petroleum products facilitated the growth of the automobile industry. It is not always one individual who is the key to the success of a given business, as Rockefeller was to the success of Standard Oil. What is really key is the role of knowledge and insights in the economy, whether they are concentrated in one individual or more widely dispersed. Some business leaders are very good at some aspects of management and very weak in other aspects. The success of the business then depends on which aspects happen to be crucial at a particular time. Sometimes two executives with very different skills and weaknesses combine to produce a very successful management team, whereas either one of them might have failed completely if operating alone. Ray Kroc, K-R-O-C, I may be mispronouncing that, founder of the McDonald's chain, was a genius at operating details and may well have known more about hamburgers, milkshakes, and french fries than any other human being, and there is a lot to know. But he was out of his depth in complex financial operations. These matters were handled by Harry Sonneborn, Sonneborn. Sonneborn? I'm not sure if I'm getting that one right either, but oh well. Who was a financial genius whose improvisations rescued the company from the brink of bankruptcy more than once during its rocky early years. But Sonneborn didn't even eat hamburgers, much less have any interest in how they were made or marketed. However, as a team, Kroc and Sonneborn made McDonald's one of the leading corporations in the world. When an industry or a sector of the economy is undergoing rapid change through new ways of doing business, sometimes the leaders of the past find it hardest to break the mold of their previous experience. For example, when the fast food revolution burst forth in the 1950s, existing leaders in restaurant franchises such as Howard Johnson were very unsuccessful in trying to compete with upstarts like McDonald's in the fast food segment of the market. Even when Howard Johnson set up imitations of the new fast food restaurants under the name Howard Johnson Jr., these imitations were unable to compete successfully because they carried over into the fast food business approaches and practices that were successful in conventional restaurants, but which slowed down operations too much to be successful in the new fast food sector, where rapid turnover with inexpensive food was the key to profits. Selecting managers can be as chancy as any other aspect of a business. Only by trial and error did the new McDonald's franchise chain discover back in the 1950s what kinds of people were most successful at running their restaurants. The first few franchisees were people with business experience who nevertheless did very poorly. The first two really successful McDonald's franchisees, who were very successful, were a working-class married couple who drained their life savings in order to go into business for themselves. They were so financially strained at the beginning that they even had trouble coming up with the $100 needed to put into the cash register on their opening day so as to be able to make change. But they ended up millionaires. Other working-class people who put everything they owned on the line to open a McDonald's restaurant also succeeded on a grand scale, even when they had no experience in running a restaurant or managing a business. When McDonald's set up its own company-owned restaurants, these restaurants did not succeed nearly as well as restaurants owned by people whose life savings were at stake. But there was no way to know that in advance. The importance of the personal factor in the performance of corporate management was suggested in another way by a study of chief executive officers in Denmark. A death in the family of a Danish CEO led, on average, to a 9% decline in the profitability of the corporation. If it was the death of a spouse, the decline was 15%, and if it was a child who died, 21%. According to the Wall Street Journal, quote, "The drop was sharper when the child was under 18 and greater still if it was the death of an only child," unquote. Although corporations are often spoken of as impersonal institutions operating in an impersonal market, both the market and the corporations reflect the personal priorities and performances of people. Market economies must rely not only on price competition between various producers to allow the most successful to continue and expand, they must also find some way to weed out those business owners or managers who do not get the most from the nation's resources. Losses accomplish that. Bankruptcy shuts down the entire enterprise that is consistently failing to come up to the standards of its competitors or is producing a product that has been superseded by some other product. Before reaching that point, however, losses can force a firm to make internal reassessments of its policies and personnel. These include the chief executive, who can be replaced by irate stockholders who are not receiving the dividends that they expected. A poorly managed company is more valuable to outside investors than to its existing owners, when these outside investors are convinced that they can improve its performance. Outside investors can therefore offer existing stockholders more for their stock than it is currently worth and still make a profit. If that stock's value later rises to the level expected when existing management is replaced by more efficient managers. For example, if the stock is selling in the market for $50 a share under inefficient management, outside investors can start buying it up at $60 a share until they own a controlling interest in the corporation. After using that control to fire existing managers and replace them with a more efficient management team, the value of the stock may then rise to $100 a share. While this profit is what motivates the investors, from the standpoint of the economy as a whole, what matters is that such a rise in stock prices usually means that either the business is now serving more customers or offering them better quality or lower prices, or is operating at lower cost, or some combination of these things. Like so many other things, running a business looks easier from the outside. On the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, the leader of the communist movement, V.I. Lenin, declared that, quote, accounting and control, unquote, were the key factors in running an enterprise, and that capitalism had already, quote, reduced, unquote, the administration of businesses to, quote, extraordinarily simple operations that any literate person can perform. That is, supervising and recording, knowledge of the 4 rules of arithmetic, and issuing appropriate receipts. Such exceedingly simple operations of registration, filing, and checking could, according to Lenin, easily be performed by people receiving ordinary workmen's wages. Yeah, interesting. After just a few years in power as ruler of the Soviet Union, however, Lenin confronted a very different and very bitter reality. He himself wrote of a fuel crisis which threatens to disrupt all Soviet work, of economic ruin, starvation, and devastation in the country, and even admitted that peasant uprisings had become, quote, a common occurrence, unquote, under communist rule. In short, the economic functions which had seemed so easy and simple before, having to perform them now, seemed almost overwhelmingly difficult. Belatedly, Lenin saw a need for people, quote, who are versed in the art of administration, unquote, and admitted that, quote, there is nowhere we can turn to for such people except the old class, unquote. That is, the capitalist businessmen. In his address to the 1920 Communist Party Congress, Lenin warned his comrades, quote, opinions on corporate management are all too frequently imbued with a spirit of sheer ignorance and anti-expert spirit, unquote. The simplicities of just 3 years earlier now required experts. Thus began Lenin's new economic policy, which allowed more market activity and under which the economy began to revive. Nearly 100 years later, with the Russian economy growing at less than 2% annually, the same lesson was learned anew by another Russian leader. A front-page story in the New York Times in 2013 reported how, quote, with the Russian economy languishing, President Vladimir V. Putin has devised a plan for turning things around, offer amnesty to some of the imprisoned business people. End of quote. And with that, we conclude Chapter 5 of Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. We will continue on to Chapter 6, the role of profits and losses, either later today or else tomorrow. Until then, as always, live free. or die trying.